Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Josh Polanin. I'm a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research and project director for the What Works Clearinghouse's Statistics, Website, and Training, or SWOT contract. On behalf of the Institute of Education and Sciences and the WWC, I welcome you to this important webinar. Today we will be discussing using WWC resources to identify interventions that meet ESSA tiers of evidence. The webinar will be led by two experts on the WWC's standards and procedures and ESSA tiers, Dr. Elizabeth Davis and Dr. Natalia Nedko-Berry. Dr. Davis is a senior researcher at AIR. She's an applied research methodologist with expertise in evaluation and education policy studies. For the WWC, she led the development of ESSA tiers of evidence tags on the review of individual studies and data from individual studies pages. She also leads the development of the WWC's online study review guide improvements and those enhancements. Dr. Nedko-Berry is a senior researcher at American Institutes for Research as well, and also works on the SWOT contract as well as the Regional Education Laboratory Midwest contract. She has extensive experience in study design and methodology. For the WWC, she leads the development of webinars and technical assistance resources. She is also leading a project to understand how various audiences use WWC website resources. Both Dr. Davis and Dr. Nedko-Berry also contributed to the version 4.1 Standards and Procedures Handbook updates that were released in January 2020. They are both experts in the current handbooks. On today's webinar, the presenters will describe the definitions and uses of the ESSA tiers of evidence, how the WWC aligns with those definitions, and where you can find resources on the WWC's website to find studies that meet ESSA requirements. The information presented will be useful in two primary situations. First, the presenters will share information that will be useful to researchers and practitioners who intend to locate studies that meet ESSA tiers 1 and 2. Second, the information provided will help researchers develop program evaluations to meet the ESSA requirements. As part of the webinar, the presenters will share links to resources within the chat box. You can also send questions to the presenters in the chat box by selecting the All Panelists and Attendees dropdown. We've set aside time at the end of the webinar for our presenters to respond to those questions. And now with that, I'll turn the webinar over to our first presenter, who will start with an overview of the ESSA tiers of evidence. Liz?
Thank you so much, Josh. I am delighted for the opportunity to present on such a great topic today. So the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, is the 2015 reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Sorry, I lost my place. ESSA replaces the previous version, No Child Left Behind, which was enacted in 2002. Some notable features of ESSA include a focus on equity and high academic standards for all. States have more control over their own goals for student achievement and accountability. ESSA got rid of a lot of unnecessary testing. School quality and other new accountability measures. There's more that go beyond just math and science. Math and reading test scores. And finally, a focus on the use of evidence-based practices, which is what we will be focusing on today. So the 2002 reauthorization of ESEA was commonly referred to as No Child Left Behind and focused on research-based programs. So the focus was on rigorous evaluation of the interventions. In 2015, ED went one step further with ESSA, and the focus shifted to evidence-based programs. So not only are we rigorously evaluating programs, but we are also focusing on the extent to which the outcomes are improving for what students and under what circumstances. So shifting the focus in this way increases the odds of achieving the desired outcome. So the argument here is that if you implement an intervention that has been shown to significantly improve the outcomes you want to improve, this increases the likelihood that this intervention is going to work for you. Under ESSA, evidence-based practices can fall under one of 4 tiers of evidence, distinguished partly but not completely by the rigor with which the practice was studied. You have Tier 1, or strong evidence, at the top, which is the strongest. Tier 2, or moderate evidence. Tier 3, or promising evidence. And finally, Tier 4, or programs that demonstrate a rationale. So let's take a closer look at the criteria for each of these tiers. So there are several categories of criteria that go into determining the evidence tier on an outcome of interest that are shown on the far left side of this table. So let's start with the criteria for Tier 1. For Tier 1, or strong evidence, a program must have been studied by a well-designed, well-implemented experimental study, or a study that meets What Works Clearinghouse standards without reservations. These include randomized control trials, or RCTs, regression discontinuity designs, and single case designs. Now, I mentioned the What Works Clearinghouse ratings here as they align with the ESSA evidence standards, but my colleague Natalia will go into much further detail about the alignment between ESSA and What Works Clearinghouse ratings in the next section. Tier 1 also requires a significant favorable effect on the outcome of interest. But a significant favorable effect from one study that meets What Works Clearinghouse standards is not sufficient if there are other studies examining the same program and outcomes that meet What Works Clearinghouse standards. Tier 1 also requires no statistically significant unfavorable effects on the same outcome from other studies of the same program meeting What Works Clearinghouse standards. So in order for an outcome to be considered overriding, it has to both come from a study that also meets What Works Clearinghouse standards, with or without reservations, which could be the same study or from a different study, and it must be statistically significant and unfavorable. Tier 1 also requires a large multi-site sample. For the purposes of ESSA, this means that a sample size of it is at least 350, level 1 usually, students, and the study must have been conducted in more than one school or more than one college campus. Note that the sample sizes and sites from studies that are examining the same intervention and the same outcomes can actually be combined to reach the threshold for these criteria, as long as they meet What Works Clearinghouse standards. And then finally, the last domain is context dependent, meaning the answer is going to be different depending on who is asking the question. So for an outcome of a program to be considered Tier 1, the sample and setting of the studies conducted to examine the effectiveness of a program must overlap with the population and the setting of the district or state that is wishing to implement that program. So turning to Tier 2, or moderate evidence, you'll see the criteria is very similar to Tier 1, but with 2 main differences. So the first difference is that Tier 2 requires at least one well-designed quasi-experimental study, or a study that aligns with, meets standards with reservations. So this can be either a well-designed quasi-experimental study or an experimental, or RCT, study with a high attrition that meets baseline equivalence. Like Tier 1 and Tier 2, like Tier 1, Tier 2 requires a significant favorable effect with no overriding negative evidence from studies that meet What Works Clearinghouse standards and a large multi-site sample. The second difference between Tiers 1 and 2 is that when aligning with the context, with the sample and setting of the studies examining the program under consideration, districts and states need only to align their population or their setting with the study context, not both. So turning to Tier 3, or promising evidence, in terms of study design, Tier 3 requires at least one well-designed and well-implemented correlational study with statistical controls for selection bias. This just means that rather than random assignment or establishing baseline equivalence between the treatment and the control groups, the study controls for selection bias using covariates that could also explain changes in the outcome. So this means that if you have a high attrition experimental or quasi-experimental study that does not meet baseline equivalence, as long as the analysis controlled for selection bias, this can meet the study design criteria for Tier 3. And like Tiers 1 and 2, Tier 3 also requires a significant favorable effect with no overriding unfavorable effects from studies that meet Whatworks Clearinghouse standards. But Tier 3 does not require a large multi-site sample or any alignment with practitioner context. So this means that an outcome that would otherwise be Tier 1 or Tier 2, but does not meet either the sample size, the multi-site requirement, or the context requirements, will meet Tier 3. And then finally, we have Tier 4. So this tier is a little less well-defined. This is for studies that did not meet the criteria for the higher tiers due to either a lack of favorable evidence, for example, something that had null effects, or a lack of statistical controls for selection bias. This could happen in a study for a few different reasons, such as not having a large enough sample size to detect the effect of an intervention. Basically, it designates that a program is worth further investigation. For federal grant competitions in the past, such as the Education Innovation Research Grants, known as EIR, they're formerly I3 grants, applicants in the past applying for early phase grants needed to provide evidence that their program innovation met Tier 4 evidence. That is, they needed to provide detail on their program's logic model, the research that backs it, and how it purports to improve outcomes. And they also needed to provide details on how they plan to study its effects. So there are a few different ways that the ESSA evidence tiers are used in practice. Educators need to identify evidence-based practices to inform their school improvement plans, and some states have developed lists of preferred practices or even their own online clearinghouses. And like I mentioned earlier, some federal grant programs previously have required applicants to back up their programs they wish to study with ESSA evidence tiers, which can be very level, depending on the level of funding. An early phase EIR grant would require Tier 4 evidence, a mid-phase EIR would require Tier 2 evidence, and an expansion grant would require Tier 1. So I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague Natalia, who's going to talk about the alignment of Whatworks Clearinghouse evidence design standards with the ESSA tiers of evidence.
Thank you, Liz. We will need the ESSA criteria that you introduced to us throughout the next segment, so thanks again for doing that. We will focus on how these criteria align with the WWC standards. Thank you. Most of you joining us today may already know that the WWC produces 3 types of products: reviews of individual studies, practice guides, and intervention reports. Today we're going to focus on the reviews of individual studies for 2 reasons. First, individual studies provide the most current information. An intervention report, for instance, will only include studies that were available at the time the report was developed. If it's a couple of years old, the most recent publications will not be included. If you need those publications, you will need to look for them in the reviews of individual studies. The second reason we'll focus on individual studies is because the WWC's tools for making an ESSA determination are currently only available for individual studies. This may change in the future, but for now, the reviews of individual studies is where you will find a lot of what you need for an ESSA determination, making your job, hopefully, a lot simpler. You will still have work to do, and we will walk you through what that means, but a lot of the work that WWC has done already, and it is available in the reviews of individual studies. Before we move on, though, one thing to note is that the WWC has a video on how to find strong, moderate, or promising evidence in practice guides and intervention reports. We're posting a link in the chat box for you right now to that video. So although we're not going to focus on practice guides and intervention reports today, this resource is available to you. I'll start us off with what goes into the review of individual studies. I will not be going into a lot of detail about the review process, only parts of the process that will help you understand why some information may or may not be available on the WWC website and how to use the information that is available. What you see on this slide are the first 3 steps in the individual study review. The first step is screening for eligibility, step 2 is review, and step 3 is rating. These 3 steps apply to all studies that are eligible for a WWC review. Once a study is reviewed, it will receive one of 3 ratings: meets WWC standards with reservations, meets WWC standards without reservations, or does not meet WWC standards. Only studies rated meets WWC standards with or without reservations will be evaluated for evidence of effectiveness. This is step 4 on your screen. What I mean when I say evidence of effectiveness is whether an intervention or program that the study examined actually produced an impact. This is where the statistical significance of findings comes into play. Step 5 on the slide is documenting context, such as the study location, for instance, and sample characteristics. Like step 4, step 5 only applies to studies that meet WWC standards with or without reservations. What happens during these 5 steps in the study review will affect what information is available on the WWC website for making an ESSA determination. This is what I will focus on for the remainder of this segment. So first off, let's consider a study's rating. Like I said, 3 ratings are possible: meets WWC standards with reservations, without reservations, or does not meet standards. The WWC has assigned an ESSA rating to all studies rated meets with or without reservations, as long as they have been reviewed under the 2.1 or later version of the WWC standards. These ESSA ratings are available on the WWC website, which we will show you in just a little bit. Before we do that, though, I would like to mention why studies rated does not meet standards do not have an ESSA rating. We also had a question about it. So the WWC did not assign ESSA ratings to studies rated does not meet standards because ESSA ratings on the WWC website are based on the information available in the study review, not the study itself, but a study review. Remember from the previous slide, the review of studies rated does not meet standards ends once this rating is assigned. So the information needed for an ESSA rating, such as significance of findings, is not captured in the review of studies that do not meet standards. These studies, however, could have significant findings, and they could also satisfy other ESSA criteria. The same goes for studies not eligible for a WWC review. So the point is, we don't want you to walk away today thinking that if a study is ineligible or rated does not meet standards, that then it does not align with the ESSA criteria for evidence, because it might. What we want you to keep in mind is that if you find a study that is of interest to you, and the WWC rated it does not meet standards, or the study is ineligible, you should do your own review of that study to decide if it aligns with the ESSA evidence definitions and meets your needs. So let's go back to the studies that have a WWC rating and an ESSA rating. One important thing to know is that these ratings are assigned at the study level. A study level rating is based on the highest rated finding. This is the left bullet on your screen. Studies often have more than one finding, and different findings can have different ratings. This will be easy to see by going through an example on the next slide. So here is a study that examined the impact of the early college high school intervention. If you selected the study from the WWC review of individual studies, you would see a study snapshot that's on the slide in front of you. In this snapshot, the study has a rating of meets WWC standards without reservations and ESSA Tier 1. These ratings are based on the highest rated finding. Like I said, though, different findings could have different ratings. To see if a study has other findings and their ratings, you'll need to click on the Findings tab, and it has a red oval around it on your screen. So once you've clicked on Findings, you would see that one finding has the highest ESSA rating, one has Tier 2, and one has none. There may be several reasons for why different outcomes have different ESSA ratings that have to do with study design and implementation. The point of us showing you this is to illustrate that you should look beyond a study snapshot to be certain the outcome that you're interested in has the rating that you're also interested in. So let's move on to the evidence of effectiveness. Like I've said, the WWC will only examine evidence of effectiveness for studies that meet the WWC standards. And evidence of effectiveness includes statistical significance, which is one of ESSA criteria. An important caveat is that the rating of effectiveness is independent of design rating. Meets WWC standards with or without reservations, those are design ratings. These ratings reflect a study's internal validity, how well it's designed and implemented. That's where things like whether a study was a randomized controlled trial or a quasi-experience matter. A rating of effectiveness, on the other hand, reflects whether an intervention or a program examined by a study made an impact. A study may be designed and implemented very well and receive a high WWC rating, but it also may have no impact on learning or other outcomes. Let's have a look at an example on the next slide. So here we have a study that is a well-designed randomized controlled trial. And the study has the highest rating of meets WWC standards without reservations. However, the study did not have any statistically significant positive findings, and there is no ESSA rating for the study, which makes sense because a statistically significant positive outcome is one criterion for all ESSA tiers except Tier 4. So one last thing about the review process that is relevant for us today is documenting study context. Same as with the evidence of effectiveness, the WWC will not document context in a study review if the study is rated does not meet standards. Only for studies rated meets WWC standards with or without reservations. Documenting context includes sample and setting characteristics, which are needed for making an ESSA determination, and one or both should overlap with population and setting of interest to meet definitions for ESSA Tier 1 and 2. The information about a study setting and sample is available on the WWC website, but again, only for studies that meet the WWC standards. So let's quickly summarize what we've covered and highlight a couple additional points. In this graphic, you see a trajectory from a WWC rating to an ESSA rating. Going from left to right, if a study is rated meets WWC standards with or without reservations, has a statistically significant effect which is positive with no overriding negative effects from causal studies and has a large multi-site sample, then such a study will have an ESSA rating of Tier 1 or Tier 2. The WWC has put all studies reviewed under the version of standards 2.1 or later through this filter. You will find ESSA ratings for these studies on the WWC website, and we showed you what they look like just a couple of slides ago. An important caveat is that an ESSA rating that you will find on the WWC website is an eligibility rating. That is because one step in the ESSA determination is to evaluate whether the sample and setting used in the study overlap with the population and setting of interest. The WWC could not complete this step because the population and setting of interest vary for each school, district, or state. That's why the final ESSA determination must be made at a local level. So if you find a study on the WWC website and it has findings with an ESSA Tier 1 or Tier 2 rating, you still have work to do to make the final determination. This is what we're showing on the right side of the slide in the blue boxes. For example, if you find a study with ESSA Tier 1 rating, you will need to compare the study setting and sample to yours. If they both overlap, then your conclusion will be that the study meets definitions for Tier 1. However, if only one overlaps, either sample or setting, then your conclusion will have to be that for your specific context, the study meets definitions for ESSA Tier 2, even though you may see Tier 1 rating on the WWC website. So again, an ESSA rating on the WWC website is an eligibility rating. You will make the final determination. You also see that we added Tier 3 on this graphic. You will not find Tier 3 ratings on the WWC website yet. However, you could make this determination after you compare a study's context to your own context. If neither setting nor sample overlap with yours, then your final ESSA determination will have to be Tier 3. So now we will go through a couple of knowledge checks to practice this material before we move on to our next segment, which will be the final segment before Q&A. Okay, we have two knowledge checks for you, and we will use the same district in both. This district is a small suburban district in the Northwest with 30% of students eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Administrators want to help students in grades 9 and 10 who are struggling with math. They want to find an intervention that has demonstrated evidence of improving math achievement in these grades. Based on funding requirements, evidence from the intervention must meet ESSA definitions for Tier 1 or Tier 2. So these administrators found a study on the WWC website that examines the effectiveness of a math tutoring program. Results of the study look promising, but the administrators want to make sure that all their criteria are met. The intervention is delivered in grades 9 and 10, it is effective, and that evidence meets definitions for ESSA Tier 1 and 2. Take a look at the study snapshot on the slide and decide which is the correct answer. Now, you can choose your answer on the polling screen that just came up, and as a reminder, you can move the screen to the side to see what's on the slide. So please go ahead and make your selection. So you still have a moment to make a selection, and we're going to move on. So we had about half of you voted, and lots of you have selected A. But, and many of you have also voted and have chosen C. Now, the C here is the correct answer. So the information in the snapshot is insufficient for making a decision. So why is that? Well, we know that the intervention is at the high school level, grades 9 and 10. We know that the intervention is effective. There's at least one statistically significant and positive finding. However, although the study has a rating of ESSA Tier 1, recall that this rating is an eligibility rating. The administrators in our example still need to confirm that the study sample and setting overlap with their sample and setting. So let's go to the next one. In this knowledge check, we continue with the same district. Small suburban district in the Northwest with 30% of students eligible for free or reduced price lunch, half male, half female. Now the administrators located additional information about the study sample and setting, which you can see at the bottom of the slide. Does the study need evidence for ESSA Tier 1 or 2? You have the screen in front of you, so please go ahead and select your answer. Okay, let's take a look at our results, and we seem to be split between B and C. Now, the correct answer for this knowledge check is B. So remember that for Tier 1, both setting and sample have to overlap with the setting and sample of interest. And for Tier 2, only one, setting or sample, needs to overlap. So let's first take a look at the study's setting. It is an urban district in the Midwest, which does not overlap with a small suburban district in the Northwest. So because the setting doesn't overlap, this could not be Tier 1. So let's see the sample overlap. So students in the study, excuse me, and in the district are in grades 9 and 10, and we have a reasonable overlap in additional characteristics, such as gender and availability and eligibility for free or reduced price lunch. It's not a perfect overlap, but it should be sufficient in most cases to conclude that definition for ESSA Tier 2 are met. So now let's transition to our final segment. We're done with the knowledge checks.
Okay, thank you, Natalia. That was really informative. And now that we have talked through how ESSA aligns with the WhatWorks Clearinghouse standards, for this final section, I wanted to showcase the WhatWorks Clearinghouse resources, where you can identify findings that meet ESSA Tiers 1 and 2 criteria. There are a few different places where you can find outcomes that meet ESSA criteria for Tiers 1 and 2. The Review of Individual Studies page, which my colleague just discussed in the previous section, and the Data from Individual Studies database. To do this, What Works Clearinghouse examined all the studies that have been reviewed under standards version 2.1 or later, and incorporates new studies automatically as they are reviewed and added to the database. So if you turn to the Review of Individual Studies page, you'll find a new feature where you can filter the studies to those where there are outcomes that meet ESSA Tier 1 and 2 criteria. Clicking on any study will bring you to the Review Details page. If the study review has outcomes that meet ESSA criteria for Tiers 1 and 2, you'll see this icon flag on the right. And then on the Findings tab, you will find the individual outcomes that meet the criteria for ESSA Tiers 1 and 2, which are also denoted with an ESSA icon on the far right of the table. So you can also use the Data from Individual Studies database. There are 7 categories that let you filter for targeted results in a pre-merged file that contains all of the data from intervention reports, studies, and findings, and this is new since about this time last year. You can filter on ratings, topics, protocols, interventions, ESSA ratings, standards versions, and outcome domains. So if you want to download the file separately, you can still do that by clicking the radio button below, and the filters will go away. So let's take a look at an example of how someone might use the data from Individual Studies database. So let's say that a director of research at a state education agency is looking for mathematics interventions that demonstrate Tier 1 evidence in improving general mathematics achievement to provide the districts in her state. So to start, she would use the ESSA tier filter to choose ESSA Tier 1. And then she may also use the outcome domain to choose general mathematics achievement. And once you have these filters in place, then you can click on the green download merged file button. So the zip file that downloads gives you a few things that I want to point out. So they have the merged file at the top, and they have instructions in a text file for downloading the CSV file into an Excel document. And then they also have a dictionary, a data dictionary with all of the variable names in order. And then within the merged file, there are actually a couple new features like findings level ratings, as Natalia discussed earlier. There is now a multi-site indicator for all studies that meet the standards, and designations for findings that meet ESSA Tiers 1 and 2. So back to our example, remember we asked for general mathematics achievement, programs that improve general mathematics achievement that meet Tier 1. The merged file returned 50 outcomes from 20 interventions that meet these criteria. And you can also use the filter functions in Excel to further filter results by other variables in the file, such as grade, program type, gender, and several other categories. So with that, I'm actually going to hand things back over to Josh to wrap things up.
Thanks, Liz, and Natalia as well, for sharing that helpful information and expanding our understanding of the ESSA tiers of evidence and where to find all this information on the WWC's website. It's clear that WWC provides a lot of resources, and it's helpful to see where that information is housed. Speaking of warehousing information, the WWC recently updated its website to include a resources page. And on it, you can find all the WWC's archived videos, webinars, and multimedia content. On the left-hand side of the page, you'll find a tab that will lead you to various WWC content. And there, if you click on the Evidence Tiers and WWC Ratings tab, you will locate numerous videos related to this very topic. This is a great place to start if you want even more detail and information related to today's webinar. Now, while the presentation occurred, some participants submitted questions, and during the registration process, participants submitted questions as well. So let's turn to those right now. And the first one is for Natalia. And this question asks, does the WWC plan to assign ESSA Tier 3 and 4 ratings? And if yes, when?
So yes, the WWC is looking into assigning Tier 3 ratings to studies that have been reviewed under the 2.1 or later version of the WWC standards. I can't answer when yet. We should know more about that later. Now, ESSA ratings for Tier 4 will not be added to the WWC website. And so remember that criteria for Tier 4 include a well-defined logic model and research or evaluation that is planned or underway. Now, these criteria are not included in the WWC review of studies, which feeds into ESSA ratings. And so these are not going to be available.
Great. Thanks, Natalia. The next question for Liz. Participant asks, what if my context doesn't align with an outcome of an intervention that meets Tier 1?
Right. So first, let me remind everybody that for ESSA context, this includes two things. You've got population and you've got your setting. Both of those things have to overlap with your population and setting for Tier 1. So if either the population or the setting overlap with your population and setting, then you would have to conclude that for your context, the outcome of interest aligns with the definition for Tier 2. But if neither the population or the setting overlap with your context, then that would mean that your outcome of interest aligns with Tier 3. And as we mentioned earlier, an ESSA tier rating on the ORC's Clearinghouse website it's basically an eligibility rating. You're going to determine the final rating for your own context, and it will depend completely on your context overlap.
That's great, Liz. Thanks. Okay, Natalia, next question for you. Participant asks, I found a study where some of the outcomes have ESSA tags, but the sample size is smaller than 350. How can that happen?
Good question. Thanks, Josh. The studies that evaluate the same program can be combined to produce an ESSA rating. One study with 100 people may be combined with another study with 400 people, and the sample size requirement of 350 will be met. So, for instance, the studies evaluating the Saxon Math program it can be combined with another study evaluating the same Saxon Math program, and each individual study will receive its own study review page on the Review of Individual Studies website. The WWC rating algorithm will combine studies of the same program together to produce an ESSA rating for individual findings.
Thanks, Natalia. Okay, the next question is for Liz and asks, when will new programs be reviewed and added to the WWC's database?
Yeah, so it's the question is really kind of always, it's ongoing. So when the What Works Clearinghouse reviews new studies on a consistent basis, they're automatically evaluated for ESSA alignment. And as soon as a study review appears on the website, it will have an ESSA rating if it has findings that align with the ESSA evidence definitions.
Perfect, Liz, thanks.
You bet.
Natalia, next question for you. Question asks, excuse me, why is a certain branded intervention with multiple studies that meet standards and a rate of mixed effects not being implemented across the country, when other interventions with no research evidence are being implemented?
So the WWC reviews and disseminates information about study design and the effectiveness of intervention, but the WWC does not endorse or provide guidance about which programs or interventions states and districts should implement. And there's several factors that may influence intervention choices by school, district, and state leaders. Maybe it's cost, maybe it's context, maybe professional development support. The addition of ESSA tiers of evidence to the WWC provides additional information about effectiveness to support states and districts when they search for evidence-based approaches. And one goal of our webinar today is to increase the awareness of the information available on the WWC website, including the resources that we have been using and showing today. But if you have any questions about specific interventions, resources, or any other questions, please submit them to the WWC Help Desk. You will find the WWC Help Desk contact form on the WWC website, and I think we will have a link when we move on to our remaining slides.
Thanks, Natalia. So there's been a number of other questions that have come in during the webinar, and we will be answering all of them and posting our responses along with the webinar content in the coming weeks. So, yes, thank you. And this now concludes our specific time for today. So I'd like to thank again our presenters, Liz and Natalia, for an engaging and informative webinar. I'd also like to thank all the participants for joining us today as we deepened our knowledge of the ESSA tiers and how the WWC can be helpful in finding additional information. Just as a reminder, the WWC SWAT team, which produced this webinar, also engages in webinars throughout the year to highlight important aspects of the WWC. We have several webinars in the works for the remainder of 2020. To learn more about webinars offered by the WWC and IES, be sure to sign up to receive notices through the IES's listserv, and the link in the chat box will take you to the listserv sign up. Finally, we will also be posting an archive of the webinar, like I said, along with the Q&A, including responses to questions that we haven't covered today. So if you have additional questions, either right now or that we haven't gotten to, please email the WWC's help desk. And with that, I'd like to thank our presenters again today and thank all of you again for joining us. We hope to have you here again soon.